What most Americans don't realize is that when Washington imposed those steep aluminum tariffs, claiming they would rebuild our industrial base, they achieved the exact opposite. They didn't bring production home. They didn't strengthen our manufacturing. What they did was expose a dependency so profound that a neighboring country could quietly walk away from us, leaving our factories scrambling for basic materials while our own policies made those materials prohibitively expensive. This is not a story about trade wars or political theater. This is a story about how institutions fail when they mistake leverage for understanding. I want you to consider something that should trouble anyone who cares about American economic strength. For decades, we built our manufacturing on the assumption that essential materials would always flow freely across our borders. Aluminum, steel, the basic building blocks of everything from cars to construction. We treated these not as strategic resources requiring careful management, but as commodities we could control through political pressure. When that assumption collapsed, it revealed something uncomfortable about how little our policymakers actually understood the systems they were trying to manipulate. The official story was straightforward enough. A 25% tariff on imported aluminum would force companies to buy American, revive shuttered smelters, and restore the industrial might that globalization had supposedly stolen from us. If you heard that logic and found it intuitive, you weren't alone. It sounds like common sense until you examine what actually happened when those tariffs went into effect. Here's what the headlines missed. The United States doesn't produce enough aluminum to meet its own needs. We never really have. For years, that gap was filled primarily by Canada, a country with abundant hydroelectric power and massive smelting capacity built specifically to serve North American demand. Aluminum flowed south as naturally as water flows downhill, keeping our factories supplied and our prices stable. What changed wasn't geology or economics. What changed was politics. When those tariffs spiked overnight, American buyers faced an impossible choice: pay dramatically higher prices for the same Canadian metal, or try to wait out what they hoped would be a temporary disruption. So they did what companies always do under uncertainty. They delayed, they postponed, they drained their existing stockpiles while hoping for a resolution that never came. And for a while, that strategy masked the underlying problem. But stockpiles aren't solutions, they're buffers. And when those buffers ran empty, reality arrived with devastating clarity. This is where I need you to understand how markets actually respond to political intervention. They don't reward nationalism. They don't respond to speeches about American strength. They respond to cost structures, profit margins, and predictable planning horizons. When Canadian suppliers looked at the new tariff environment, they saw something that should have been obvious to anyone designing trade policy: massive political risk layered on top of what had been a stable, mutually beneficial relationship. While Washington celebrated its tough stance, Canadian aluminum producers were quietly rerouting their shipments. Europe, facing its own supply concerns and eager to reduce dependence on Chinese production, offered stable, tariff-free alternatives. Existing trade agreements made the transition seamless. Within months, what had been an almost automatic pipeline into the United States became a diversified export strategy flowing east instead of south. Now, this is where the story becomes a case study in unintended consequences. As aluminum became structurally more expensive in the United States than anywhere else in the world, every industry that relied on that metal felt the shock simultaneously. Automakers, construction companies, food packaging, electronics. If your sector depended on aluminum, you were suddenly carrying a cost disadvantage that your global competitors didn't face. You were paying more for the same raw material before a single worker clocked in or a single machine started running. What strikes me as particularly revealing is how little our political leadership seemed to understand this dynamic. They treated aluminum as if it existed in isolation, as if you could simply make one input more expensive without affecting everything downstream. But aluminum isn't optional in modern manufacturing. It's embedded in the cost structure of nearly everything we build at scale. When you impose a 25% tax on aluminum, you're not just taxing foreign producers, you're taxing your own industrial base. The response from American companies was entirely predictable if you understand how capitalism actually functions under pressure. Some absorbed the higher costs temporarily, hoping for relief. Others passed them directly to consumers, contributing to the inflation that working families are still feeling today. But the most consequential response was the quietest one. Major manufacturers began sourcing more aggressively outside the United States, not because they wanted to abandon American workers, but because the economics no longer made sense. This brings us to what I consider the deepest institutional failure in this entire episode. For decades, American trade policy has been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how global supply chains actually work. Policymakers treat them as if they're machines you can simply reprogram with the right combination of tariffs and pressure, but supply chains are more like ecosystems. They evolve, they adapt, and when you introduce sudden shocks, they don't bend to your will, they route around the source of instability. Canada understood this better than we did. Instead of retaliating with dramatic counter tariffs or engaging in the kind of political theater that dominates our news cycles, Ottawa focused on something far more valuable: predictability. While American policy lurched from one trade threat to the next, Canada offered what global capital actually wants: clear rules, stable enforcement, and planning horizons measured in years rather than news cycles. The result was as inevitable as it was ignored by our media. Japanese automakers, Korean steel producers, European manufacturers, they didn't announce their pivot away from American supply chains with press releases. They simply began treating the United States as a higher risk environment and adjusting their investments accordingly. When uncertainty becomes the defining feature of your policy environment, rational actors respond by reducing their exposure to you. Now, I want to be very clear about something. This wasn't Canada punishing the United States out of spite or malice. This was a rational economic actor protecting itself from a partner that had become unpredictably volatile. When you impose sudden tariffs on a country that has been your most reliable supplier for decades, you're not demonstrating strength. You're demonstrating that commitments mean nothing, that agreements can be unilaterally rewritten, and that long-term planning around your market is a fool's game. The Americans who paid the price for this miscalculation weren't the policymakers who designed it. They were the workers whose factories suddenly faced higher input costs, the consumers whose cars and appliances became more expensive, and the communities whose planned expansions were quietly postponed because the fundamental economics had shifted. This is how trade policy translates into kitchen table economics, not through grand geopolitical victories or defeats, but through the accumulation of small disruptions that make everyday life more expensive and less secure. What particularly troubles me is how this episode reveals the gap between political messaging and institutional competence. The rhetoric was all about bringing manufacturing home, about restoring American industrial independence, but the actual policy mechanism, sudden tariffs on essential inputs, made domestic manufacturing less competitive, not more. If you wanted to design a system to drive production offshore, you could hardly do better than making the basic materials of manufacturing prohibitively expensive inside your own borders. The broader strategic implications are even more concerning. For generations, American economic policy was built on a simple but powerful insight: prosperity is more durable than coercion. We became the center of global commerce not by forcing others to trade with us, but by making ourselves indispensable. We offered the largest market, the most stable currency, and the most predictable legal framework. That combination created what economists call network effects. Everyone wanted to be part of the system because everyone else was already part of it. What the aluminum crisis exposed is how quickly those network effects can reverse when the center becomes unstable. Canada didn't need to threaten us or impose retaliatory measures. It simply needed to demonstrate that reliable alternatives existed. European buyers didn't need to be convinced to diversify away from American-dominated supply chains. They just needed to see that depending on unpredictable partners carried unnecessary risks. This is why I find the current trajectory so troubling. We're not witnessing the decline of American economic power because our fundamentals are weak. We're witnessing its erosion because our institutions have forgotten the difference between strength and volatility. Real power in a global economy comes from being the safe choice, the predictable partner, the country that honors its commitments even when political winds shift. When you abandon that role for the temporary satisfaction of imposing costs on others, you don't demonstrate dominance. You demonstrate that you no longer understand how influence actually works. The aluminum shortage that followed was entirely avoidable. American companies began paying premium prices for metal that had once flowed freely across our borders. Construction projects were delayed, manufacturing costs soared, and meanwhile, Canadian producers were building deeper relationships with European buyers, creating the kind of institutional bonds that don't disappear when a single trade dispute resolves. What we're seeing now is the maturation of those alternative relationships. Canada's aluminum increasingly flows east rather than south, not because of continuing hostility, but because new supply chains, once established, create their own momentum. European buyers who were forced to diversify discovered that Canadian suppliers offered not just competitive prices, but something even more valuable: reliability. They didn't have to worry that a political announcement could overnight double their input costs. This is how economic influence actually erodes in the modern world, not through dramatic confrontations or decisive defeats, but through the gradual realization that dependence on an unpredictable partner is a strategic liability. Other countries don't declare independence from American-centered systems. They simply build alternatives and quietly reduce their exposure over time. I've spent decades observing how American power has been exercised around the world, and what concerns me most about this episode is not the immediate economic disruption that can be managed and eventually overcome. What concerns me is the signal it sent about our institutional competence. When allies and trading partners conclude that American policy is driven by impulse rather than strategy, by political convenience rather than long-term planning, they begin making decisions that account for our unreliability. The aluminum crisis was never really about aluminum. It was about whether the United States still understood the foundations of its own prosperity. For 70 years, we built the global economy around American institutions because those institutions were perceived as stable, predictable, and fair. When that perception erodes, so does the willing cooperation that made American leadership both possible and profitable. History offers us useful lessons here, though we seem reluctant to learn from them. Every great power that has lost its central position in the global economy has done so not because it was conquered, but because it gradually became more trouble than it was worth. Partners found alternatives, allies hedged their bets, and what had once been a network organized around American convenience slowly reorganized itself around American irrelevance. We're not there yet, and this outcome is not inevitable. But the aluminum crisis showed us the path we're on if we continue to mistake disruption for strategy. Real institutional strength isn't built by imposing costs on others. It's built by making yourself indispensable, reliable, and worthy of trust. When we abandon that approach for the temporary satisfaction of forcing others to bend to our will, we don't demonstrate power, we demonstrate its absence. The question that should keep serious policymakers awake at night is not whether we can force other countries to accept disadvantageous terms. The question is whether we can still build the kind of institutions that make cooperation profitable for everyone involved. Because in the end, that's the only foundation for prosperity that lasts longer than a single political cycle. The aluminum crisis exposed more than our dependence on foreign supplies. It exposed our dependence on others' willingness to tolerate our behavior. And that kind of dependence, once acknowledged, becomes the defining constraint on everything that follows.